Darren opened his eyes from a blow to his ribs. Standing over him was a broad-shouldered man with a gray beard and a leather apron. The man said that the sun had risen an hour ago and that a lazy apprentice was bringing shame to his workshop. Darren tried to reply and realized he didn't know where he was. Just yesterday, he had been an engineer at a design bureau. He'd worked on a project late into the night and fallen asleep right at his desk. And now he was lying on a straw mattress in a dark hut with a dirt floor. It smelled of wood shavings and smoke. Someone else's memories flooded his mind in a wave. His name was Darren. He was 19 years old. He was an apprentice to the wheelwright Henrik in the village of Videmore on Baron Edvald's lands. The Darren of the past had been a diligent but dim-witted young man. He was considered the weakest apprentice in the village's living memory. Master Henrik kept him on out of pity for his late parents. Darren sat down on the mattress and pressed his palms against his temples. Two lives fit together in his mind like two planks into a single groove. He stood up and reached for his bag hanging from his belt. His fingers brushed against a smooth, cold plate. He pulled it out and froze. Inside the wheelwright's apprentice's bag lay a tablet, a thin black rectangle with a glowing screen. Darren closed the bag and stepped out into the courtyard so no one would see. Behind the woodpile, he took the device out again. The screen lit up on its own without him pressing any buttons. A message glowed on it. Repository of Human Technology, Level 1 Accessible. Below were lines from a list. Moldboard plow. Hand-operated water pump. Well filter. Foot-powered potter's wheel. Hundreds more entries were grayed out and couldn't be opened. A counter glowed beneath the list. Improve the lives of 100 people, and you'll gain access to the second level. For now, the counter read 0. Darren ran his finger along the line for the plow. The screen displayed a blueprint with dimensions and assembly instructions. Each part was specified for the tools of this century. His heart began to pound so hard that he felt hot. He hid the tablet under his shirt and returned to the workshop. Henrik ordered the new mill wheel to be loaded onto the wagon. The old wheel at the village mill had jammed 3 days ago, and the entire district was left without flour. The miller had promised Henrik good money for the replacement. They reached the mill around noon. Half the village was crowded at the weir with sacks of grain. The miller, Oswald, was running back and forth along the flume, cursing. Henrik examined the old wheel and scratched his beard. He said it would take 2 days to remove it, and another day to install the new one. The crowd began to murmur. The people had been without bread for a week already. Just then, Darren walked up to the shaft and crouched down near the support. He looked at the structure for just a minute. Then he straightened up and said there was no need to replace the wheel. He explained that the shaft had sagged a finger's width in the support, causing the edge of the wheel to catch on the trough. He said that if they wedged the support and moved the stop beam further upstream, the wheel would run smoothly and last another 5 years. A hush fell over the weir. Henrik opened his mouth and forgot to close it. The miller asked who had taught the apprentice to speak that way. The old Darren couldn't tell a hub from a rim without a hint. But this Darren was already crawling under the shaft with a wedge and a hammer. He worked quickly and precisely. Every blow landed exactly where it was needed. An hour later, he ordered the sluice gate to be opened. The water struck the blades. The wheel gave a jolt and began to turn smoothly without a single squeak. The millstones hummed inside the mill. The crowd gasped in unison. Oswald stared at Darren as if he were a ghost. Henrik silently shifted his gaze from his apprentice to the wheel and back again. Darren wiped his hands on his pants and felt a warm throbbing beneath his shirt. He stepped around the corner of the mill and glanced at the screen. The counter read 47. The mill was feeding nearly 50 people, and all of them had received flour today. The system had counted everyone. Darren smiled for the first time in 2 days. The path was clear. The more people lived well, the more knowledge was revealed. And there was enough knowledge to reach all the way to the stars. That evening in the workshop, Heinrich was silent for a long time. Then he set a bowl of porridge with butter in front of his apprentice. Darren hadn't been allowed butter before. The master said that tomorrow they would go look at his drawings, if he had any. Darren nodded, and at that moment, the sound of hooves came from the courtyard. A horseman in the Baron's colors rode through the gate. He unfurled a scroll and shouted across the street, "Baron Edwald is doubling the grain tax for the fall harvest. Whoever fails to pay the required amount will forfeit their livestock or be sent to work in the quarry." The horseman galloped away, and a heavy silence hung over the village. Henrik said the village couldn't handle double the tax and that the land would no longer yield a harvest. Darren watched the horseman ride off and said nothing. The land yields only as much as the plow allows. And the plow in this village hadn't changed in 300 years. He slipped his hand under his shirt and clutched the warm edge of the tablet. Fall was 4 months away. Time was running out. The engineer awoke in the body of Darren, an apprentice to wheelwright Henrik in the village of Widemore, and discovered a tablet containing technologies where new levels are unlocked by improving people's lives. He repaired the mill, impressing the village and the miller, Oswald, and the counter showed 47 out of 100. Baron Edwald doubled the grain tax by fall, and Darren decided to start with a new plow. In the morning, Darren laid out a board with charcoal in front of Heinrich and began to sketch. He drew a plow with a blade curved like a wave. He explained that the old plowshare merely scratched the soil, whereas the curved blade cut into the soil layer and turned it over. Weeds were pushed down and left to rot. Moisture was retained in the furrow. The soil could breathe. The harvest yield increased by 1.5 times, or even doubled. Heinrich listened and frowned. He said that wood wouldn't withstand such a load. Darren replied that the cutting edge needed to be forged from iron. For that, they needed the blacksmith Tob. Tob was the best blacksmith in 3 villages and the most stubborn man in 10. They arrived at his smithy after noon. Tob listened and burst out laughing. He said that their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had plowed with a plow and no one had complained. He said he wouldn't waste iron on the fantasies of a boy who'd only learned to hold a hammer yesterday. Darren didn't argue. He asked how much Tob charged for a plowshare. Tob named his price. Darren offered double that amount, but on one condition. If the plow plowed 3 times as much in a day as the old one, Tob would return the money and forge such plowshares in exchange for a share of the sales. If it didn't, the money would stay with Tob, along with the iron. The blacksmith narrowed his eyes and slapped the outstretched palm. Henrik handed over the money. The master emptied half his money box and said that either his apprentice would ruin him or make him rich. The work took 9 days. Darren remembered those days as one long day. There he stands by the forge, showing Taba the curve of the plowshare using a wooden template. Here he is with Heinrich, carving the beam from an oak log and fitting the harness hooks. Here he is reworking the plowshare attachment for the 3rd time because the first 2 came loose during a test furrow. And here stands the finished plow in the middle of the yard, with the neighborhood boys running their fingers over the gleaming plowshare. The test was scheduled for the communal field on St. Ursula's Day. The whole village turned out. Elder Humbert came as well. For 40 years, Humbert had settled land disputes and didn't believe anything he hadn't seen with his own eyes. He stood at the edge of the field with the look of a man who'd been torn away from important business for the sake of a fairground trick. He said loudly that if the boy ruined the communal strip of land, he would have to pay double its price. Oswald's pair of oxen were harnessed to the plow. After the incident with the wheel, the miller trusted Darren like a priest. Darren took hold of the handles and plowed the first furrow. The plowshare cut into the turf like a knife through bread. The soil rose and turned over in a shiny black wave. The oxen walked steadily and didn't even strain. In an hour, Darren covered as much ground as a plowman with an old plow would cover in half a day. The people lining the field were silent at first. Then someone whistled.
Then the men climbed into the furrow to feel the soil with their hands. Humbert stood motionless.
Then he walked over to the furrow. He dropped to his knees right in his new festive pants. He picked up a clod of earth and rubbed it between his fingers. He looked at the even row of turned-over soil stretching all the way to the edge of the field. His face changed slowly, like the sky before a storm. He stood up and said quietly that with a plow like this, the village would survive even double or triple the tax. Then he turned to Darren and bowed to him first. The elder never bowed to anyone but the Baron. The crowd erupted in shouts. Tob pushed his way forward and silently placed the money back into Heinrich's palm. He said that starting tomorrow morning, he would be forging plowshares, and that the door to his smithy was always open to the boy. That evening, the display showed 91. Orders poured in from all over the region. The three of them worked together. Henrik handled the wood. Tob handled the iron. Darren drew up the blueprints and checked every joint. In 2 weeks, they assembled 11 plows. Neighboring villages sent messengers. Then something happened that Darren hadn't expected. Cassius, a merchant from the city of Oldenburg, arrived in Wademore. A stout man with intelligent eyes and rings on every finger. He spent 2 hours walking around the workshop, clicking his tongue. Then he offered to buy the plow blueprint from Darren for 100 silver coins and a promise never to make any more like it. Darren refused. Cassius smiled and said the boy was wrong to think things can be made freely. He said that there was a guild of craftsmen in Oldenburg and that the guild didn't like it when someone worked without its seal. He said this gently, almost affectionately. Then he got into his wagon and drove away. Heinrich watched the wagon drive away with a heavy look on his face. He said that the guild had already ruined 2 independent craftsmen in the area. They burned down one man's barn. The other was convicted of working without a hallmark, and his tools were confiscated. Darren listened and realized that his first victory had just given birth to his first real enemy. That night, a knock on the window woke him. Oswald was standing on the threshold with a lantern. The miller's face was ashen. He said there was trouble at his house. His daughter had been burning with fever since last night, and that there were already 7 such patients in the village. And all of them had drunk from the lower well. Darren, along with Henrik and the blacksmith Tob, built a moldboard plow and, during a community trial, convinced the skeptical elder Humbert. After that, orders poured in from all over the district, and the count reached 91. The merchant Cassius from Oldenburg was refused a purchase of the blueprint and hinted at revenge the Craftsmen's Guild. That night, Oswald reported that his daughter and 6 others had fallen ill with a fever and that they had all drunk from the lower well. Darren got dressed in a minute and followed Oswald through the dark village. The miller's house smelled of vinegar and fear. A girl of about 10 was tossing and turning on a bench. Oswald's wife was changing the wet rags on her forehead. Darren asked about the water and their stomachs. The miller's wife replied that all the sick had first experienced stomach cramps, followed by a fever. Darren ordered that all drinking water be boiled immediately and that no one be allowed near the lower well. In the morning, he went to the well himself. The well stood in a low-lying area below the livestock pens. Darren peered into the log cabin and understood everything without even needing the tablet. In the spring, manure runoff seeped into the ground, and the earth carried it straight into the water vein. For centuries, people had been drinking poison and calling their illnesses divine punishment. He opened the tablet behind the barn. 2 lines were highlighted in the first-level list: hand-operated water pump, sand and charcoal well filter. Next to them, the screen automatically highlighted a 3rd line that had previously been gray: wastewater drainage. It was as if the system understood what was happening in the village. Darren called a meeting at Humbert's house. He spoke simply. Illness comes not from the wrath of the heavens, but from dirty water. Dirt from the yards flows underground into the well. We need to seal off the lower well. We need to deepen the upper one and install a pump with a filter on it. We need to dig a drainage ditch with a clay lining so that the runoff flows past the pasture into a pit. The crowd remained silent, skeptical. Then Father Matthias stepped forward. The village priest was a stern, austere man. He said that sickness and health were in the hands of heaven. He said that digging ditches against the will of heaven was like arguing with a thunderstorm. The people nodded. The priest's word carried more weight than a boy's. Darren didn't argue with heaven. He proposed a compromise. Let half the village live as they had been, and those who agreed should drink only boiled water, and water from the upper well for a week. If heaven wished to punish them, it would punish everyone equally. If the problem was with the water, however, new cases would appear only among the first group. Matthias hesitated but agreed, because refusal would have looked like fear. The week dragged on like a month. Darren didn't sit idly by. Together with Tob, they cast and assembled a pump according to the blueprints. The piston moved tightly and smoothly within the copper sleeve. Together with Henrik, they built a canopy over the upper well and filled the filter box with layers of sand and crushed coal. The men from the compliant half dug a ditch. The water flowing from the pump's spout was clear and sweet-tasting. People even came to gaze at it as if it were a miracle. By the end of the week, the results were clear. None of those who drank boiled and filtered water fell ill. Among the rest, 5 more took to their beds. Oswald's daughter got back on her feet on the 6th day because Darren had instructed them to give her small sips of boiled water with salt and honey. On Sunday, Father Matthias came to the pump himself. He pumped the lever for a long time, watching as the clear stream gushed into the bucket. Then he filled a mug and drank it all. His hands were shaking. He turned to the people and said that he now saw the plan differently. He said that heaven had given people reason so that they could ward off misfortune themselves. And that clean water was just as pleasing to heaven as prayer. From that day on, the whole village, together with the priest, dug the ditch. That same Sunday evening, the tablet vibrated so strongly under his shirt that Darren flinched. The counter read 106. The screen flashed gold. Level 2 unlocked. The list expanded with new entries. A letterpress printing press, a small-scale blast furnace, a foot-powered lathe, a wind pump, a horse-drawn mower. Improve the lives of 1,000 people, and you'll unlock the 3rd level. Darren sat behind the woodpile and read the names as if they were the most wonderful book in the world. 1,000 people! One village wasn't enough for that. For that, he needed a city. It was as if fate had heard his thoughts. 3 days later, 4 horsemen rode into Widemore. Leading the way was a thin man in an expensive gray cloak, wearing the steward's chain across his chest. It was Gottfried, Baron Edwald's steward. The village fell silent. The steward was known as a man who squeezed every last grain out of the taxes. Gottfried dismounted at Henrik's workshop and gazed silently for a long time at the row of finished plows. Then at the pump by the well. Then at the freshly dug ditch. He asked who had come up with all this. Humbert stepped forward and said that it was the master's apprentice, Darren, who had thought of it, and that thanks to him, the village would be able to collect even double the tax. Gottfried looked at Darren with the long, calculating gaze of an accountant. He said that rumors of the plow had reached Regenholm Castle. He said that Baron Edwald wished to see the craftsman in person in 3 days. He said this without a smile. Then he added that the Baron would consider a refusal an insult. The horseman turned and rode off at a trot. Henrik placed a hand on his apprentice's shoulder. The master's hand was heavy and cold. He said that craftsmen returned from Regenholm Castle either with gold or in shackles, and that Baron Edwald would accept no third option. Darren identified the source of the fever as a contaminated lower well and, after a week-long investigation, convinced the village and the skeptical priest, Matthias, after which he built a pump with a filter and a drainage ditch. The counter exceeded 100, unlocking the 2nd level with a printing press, a blast furnace, and other technologies.
The third level requires 1,000 people.
Steward Gottfried delivered Baron Edwald's order to report to Regenholm Castle in 3 days, and refusal would be considered an insult. For 3 days, Darren prepared for the trip as if it were an exam on which his life depended. He wondered what to bring the Baron. The tablet had already suggested weapons at the second level. An upgraded crossbow bow was listed next to the printing press. Darren closed that entry and made up his mind. He would never carry a weapon for anyone as long as there was another way. The Baron had to be won over not with death but with profit. He loaded a small pump which he'd assembled over 2 nights onto the cart. He also took a model plow about an elbow's length long and a hand-powered winnower that he and Henrik had finished the day before. The winnower separated the grain from the chaff 10 times faster than tossing it by hand. Henrik went with him. The master said he wouldn't let a single apprentice go into the wolf's den alone. Regenholm Castle stood on a cliff above the river, a day's journey away. At the foot of the cliff lay a town of 1,500 souls. Darren looked at the tiled roofs and counted not the houses but the people. There it was, 1,000 for the third level. They were kept waiting in the castle courtyard for 2 hours. Then the guards led them into the great hall. Baron Edwald turned out to be a heavy-set man of about 50, with tired, angry eyes. Standing to his right was Gottfried. Seated to his left was a young knight with a contemptuous smirk. It was Raimund, the Baron's nephew. The Baron ordered them to show what they had brought. Raimund said loudly that his uncle was wasting his time on a village magician. He said that a peasant's miracles end where real business begins. Darren bowed and asked for a barrel of water and 2 servants. He assembled the pump right on the stone floor in a quarter of an hour. Then he proposed a simple contest to Raimund. Let the knight carry water in buckets from the barrel to the vat on the platform. Meanwhile, the servant would operate the lever. Whoever filled his vat first would be the winner. The hall burst into giggles. Raimund flared up and grabbed the buckets to teach the insolent man a lesson. 5 minutes later, the knight stood there, wet and red-faced, while the vat by the pump was filled to the brim. The servant wasn't even out of breath. Baron Edwald laughed for the first time during the reception. He laughed for a long time. Then Darren demonstrated the winnower and a model of the plow. He spoke in a language the Baron understood best. He spoke about grain. The plow increases the harvest by 1.5 times. The winnower saves the time of 100 workers. The pumps fill the castle's cisterns in an hour instead of a day. More grain means more taxes without riots and without flogging. Gottfried quickly calculated something on a wax tablet and whispered it into the Baron's ear. The steward's figures matched the promises. The Baron slapped his palm on the armrest and announced his decision. The craftsman would move into the castle and become the court master craftsman. His salary would be 20 coins a month. The hall buzzed with approval. And then Darren did something that made Henrik turn pale. He refused. In the silence, the crackling of the torches could be heard. Darren spoke quickly before the Baron had a chance to get angry. A master locked away in the castle would be of only 1/100th the use to the Baron. The workshop must be located between the village and the town so that workers can be trained and machines installed throughout the Baron's lands. Let the Baron grant him a courtyard in the town beneath the cliff and the right to work freely under the Baron's seal. In return, every 10th machine will go to the castle free of charge, and every coin of income will be shared with the Baron's treasury according to a fair share. The Baron does not grow rich from a single craftsman. The Baron grows rich from the land where machines stand in every village. Gottfried froze with his pen raised. Then he slowly leaned toward the Baron and said that the boy was offering more than he was asking for. Baron Edwald looked at Darren intently and for a long time. Then he said that this was the first time he'd seen a man bargain in his hall and live to tell the tale, and that the courtyard by the south gate, with its warehouse and smithy, was, as of that day, registered to Master Darren, and that he would receive the seal from Gottfried. But in return, by spring, the castle cisterns and the town market must be supplied with water, and the baron's fields must receive new plows. They rode back in silence for half the journey. Then Henrik exhaled and said that the apprentice was either born under a lucky star, or the heavens were guiding him by the hand. In the small town at the southern, they took over a courtyard with a sagging roof and a cold smithy. From there, time flew by in a flurry of activity. Here, Tob is moving into town with his anvil and hammers, cursing the town's coal. Here, the first 6 apprentices from Widemore and the town outskirts are taking their places at the workbenches. Here, in the market square, a clear stream gushes from the city's first fountain, and market women place buckets beneath it, their faces full of skepticism. Here, Gottfried arrives for an inspection with pursed lips and leaves with a new winnowing machine for the castle granaries. By the first snowfall, the counter read 420. The city embraced machines faster than the countryside because the city knew how to count money. In the evenings, Darren would open the second level and stare at the same line. A printing press with movable type. He understood that pumps improved the lives of hundreds, but letters changed the lives of thousands. The knowledge locked away in the monastery's books was worth more than gold. He began carving his first letters out of hard maple at night. And then an unexpected guest arrived at the workshop, a young monk in a worn habit with ink stains on his fingers. He introduced himself as Brother Anselm, a scribe from the monastery of St. Coloman. He said he'd heard at the market that the master was building a machine that writes books on its own. He said he'd come to see this lie with his own eyes and expose it. Because a book is a scribe's prayer, and a prayer cannot be entrusted to iron. Darren wiped his hands and slid the bolt on the door to the inner room aside. He said that lies must be exposed and that Brother Anselm should come in and see for himself. At Regenholm Castle, Darren put the mocking Ryman to shame with a contest involving a pump and convinced Baron Edwald with profit figures, after which he declined the position of courtmaster and bargained for a courtyard in the city with the right to work freely under the Baron's seal. Over the winter, the workshop, with Tob and his apprentices, installed water columns and winnowing machines throughout the city, and the tally reached 420.
Darren began secretly cutting type for the printing press, and Brother Anselm, a scribe intent on exposing the bookmaking machine, appeared at the workshop. Brother Anselm entered the inner room with the expression of a judge.
In the middle of the room stood the press, an oak frame, a screw with a lever. A flat plate above the table with a type case. Maple type lay in rows inside the case. Darren silently set a line on the typesetting machine.
He chose words that the scribe knew by heart. The first line of the morning prayer. He secured the typeset, coated it with soot-based ink mixed with linseed oil, placed a sheet of paper on top, and pulled the lever. The screw pressed down on the plate with a soft creak. Darren tilted back the frame and handed the sheet to the monk. The line lay on the paper, even and black. Each letter stood like a soldier in formation. Anselm took the sheet between 2 fingers. His lips moved. He had been copying books for 11 years. His best page took a full day's work. This line had taken a minute. He asked how many such sheets the machine produced in a day. Darren replied that with 1 typeset page and 2 workers, they'd get 1,500 copies. Anselm sat down on a bench because his legs wouldn't hold him up. He sat there for a long time. Then he said quietly that for 11 years he had prayed with his pen, letter by letter, and that this machine prays for an entire monastery in a single day. He raised his eyes, and there was no anger in them. There was hunger. He asked if it was possible to print not just a single line, but an entire book. And so the workshop gained its first bookbinder. Anselm did not return to the monastery for Vespers. He stayed at the typesetting desk until midnight and mastered it faster than any of the other apprentices. The weeks that followed are etched in Darren's memory as snapshots. Here is Tob casting the first tin letters to replace the maple ones, grumbling about the precision of the molds until the 10th casting comes out clean. Here is Anselm compiling his first book, not a prayer book, but an alphabet book with pictures and counting charts. Here, the first 100 sheets are drying on ropes, and the students walk beneath them as if beneath festive flags. Here, at the winter fair, the alphabet book is sold for the price of 2 chickens, whereas a handwritten book cost as much as a cow. By spring, the printing press had produced 4,000 primers and calendars marking sowing dates. The calendars were distributed to every village in the barony. The counter shot up like floodwaters. 600, 800, 900. People in the villages began to recognize Darren by sight. Then came what troubled him even more than the guild. At the market, an old woman kissed his hand and called him a messenger. A cart driver from a distant village asked earnestly if it were true that the spirit of progress brought the master his blueprints in his dreams. Father Matthias came from Viedmore and shook his head. He said that people were drawn to miracles and that, left unchecked, miracles gave rise to heresy faster than godlessness. Darren brushed it off with a joke, but inside he grew cold. He could see where the rumors were headed. And the rumors were spreading beyond the villages. Cassius hadn't forgotten the rejection. The Oldenburg Guild of Masters had sent a letter to the cities declaring the printing press an attack on the honest labor of scribes and engravers. And through the trade caravans, even more outlandish rumors began to spread. That in the workshop by the southern gate, iron moved on its own, as if the master were whispering to a box that glowed in the dark. Darren had tightened security and no longer took the tablet from under his shirt, not even in front of his apprentices. But word traveled faster than any precautions. On St. Mark's Day, the counter read 1030. The tablet glowed gold in the darkness of the storeroom. The 3rd level had been unlocked. Darren read the list and his throat went dry. An atmospheric steam engine. Coke and foundry work. Sheet glass. A simple microscope. Smallpox vaccine. He read the line about smallpox 3 times. Last summer, smallpox had wiped out 1 in 10 people in the neighboring barony. In his hands lay the salvation of thousands. And he already knew that this very salvation would turn out to be the most dangerous of all. The machines affected people's wallets. The vaccine affected their faith. On Sunday, Darren stood at the service in the city church among his students. After the service, an unfamiliar priest stepped up to the altar. A tall man with a face as gray and still as winter water. He unfurled a document bearing the seal of the Bishop of Oldenburg. He introduced himself as Father Verekund, investigator for the Episcopal Curia. He read aloud slowly and clearly. News had reached the bishop's throne of machines of unknown origin, of books being printed without blessing or supervision, and of a man whom the common folk had begun to call the messenger of another god. Therefore, the Curia is opening an inquiry into heresy in the city of Regenholm. Anyone who knows anything about Master Darren's activities must appear and testify. Concealing the truth is considered complicity. Verekund rolled up the document and scanned the church with his gaze. His gaze settled on Darren and froze. The investigator stared for a long time without blinking. Then he spoke softly, but in the deathly silence of the temple, everyone heard him. He said he would begin with the master himself, and that at dawn tomorrow, the master was to be at the church house for the first interview. Until the investigation was complete, the printing press was ordered to remain silent. Anselm, standing next to Darren, clenched a fresh print of the alphabet in his fist so tightly that his fingers turned white. The apprentices looked at the master and waited for him to speak. Darren looked at the interrogator calmly. Inside, everything was tightening into a cold knot, but he couldn't lower his eyes. Here, lowering one's eyes was interpreted as an admission of guilt. The scribe Anselm witnessed the printing press in action, and having gone from accuser to the workshop's chief scribe, saw the alphabets and calendars spread throughout the barony. The counter exceeded 1,000, unlocking the 3rd level with a steam engine and a smallpox vaccine. The people began to call Darren the messenger of the god of progress, while the Cassius Guild distributed letters denouncing the printing press and spread rumors about a glowing box. The bishop's inquisitor, Father Verekund, announced an inquisition into heresy in the cathedral, banned the printing press, and summoned Darren at dawn for their first interview. Darren didn't sleep until the third cockcrow. He wondered how to speak to a man for whom any answer could become evidence. Force wouldn't work here. The Baron wouldn't quarrel with the bishop over a craftsman. That meant he'd have to use his head. At dawn, he entered the church building alone. Veracun sat at a long table with a scribe to his left. Before him lay an alphabet, a calendar, and a stack of reports as thick as a finger. The interrogator began quietly and politely. He asked where the master got his knowledge. Darren replied with a prepared truth. He said that he read the world like a book, that water had always flowed downward and turned wheels long before him, that a lever was a lever in the days of his grandfathers and great-grandfathers, that he merely arranged what was known to all in a new order, just as a scribe arranges letters into words. The scribe's pen scratched across the paper. Veracun asked about the glowing box of reports. Darren was prepared for this as well. He placed on the table a piece of rotten wood that glowed in the dark and a jar of marsh fireflies. He said that the dark folk had seen night work done with such lamps, and that fear has big eyes. Veracun stared at the rotten wood for a long time. Then he asked the most important question.
Why do the people call the master a messenger? And aren't machines a form of pride that supplants the design of the heavens? Darren replied slowly, weighing each word. He said that grain grows by the will of the heavens, and the plow merely prepares the soil, and the plowman with his plow is not proud. He said that holy men had composed the prayer, and the machine merely repeats it without a single error, whereas a weary scribe makes mistakes and distorts the holy words. And then he laid out his trump card. He unfolded a fresh printout before the interrogator. It was the first page of the prayer book, typeset by Anselm in a uniform, large font that even an old man with failing eyesight could read. Darren said he was ready to print holy books under the supervision of the curia, with each typeset proofread. That 1,000 inexpensive prayer books would reach places no scribe had ever reached, and that it was up to the bishop to decide whose instrument the press would become. Veracun remained silent for a long time. His fingers lay motionless on the print. Darren could see that within the interrogator, a struggle was raging between fear of the new and the hunger of a minister, dreaming of the word being accessible to every parish. Finally, Veracun said that the investigation was not closed, but postponed. That the printing press would be put into operation, but every sheet would be brought to him for inspection before sale. That the master would remain under supervision until the bishop made a final decision, and that he wished to see the first 100 prayer books by the summer solstice. Darren left the church house on wobbly legs. He had won not an acquittal, but a reprieve. But the reprieve was more important to him than an acquittal. The workshop breathed a sigh of relief and doubled its output. Spring went on in fits and starts. Here is Anselm with 2 apprentices typesetting a prayer book. He personally carries the sheets to Veracun and returns from him with a strange look on his face, because the proofreader is correcting typos with the zeal of a true scribe. Here is Tob firing up the first small coke-fired blast furnace according to the 3rd-level blueprint, and after 2 failed smelting attempts, cast iron as pure as ever flows from the tap. Here is the glassblower Jorgen, lured by rumors from the Free City, setting up a furnace for sheet glass against the eastern wall, and the workshop's first windows glisten in the sun so that passers-by stop to watch. By the solstice, 100 worshippers had laid themselves on Veracun's altar. The investigator accepted them without a single word, but that same evening sent an order from the curia for 300 more. The counter read 1,600. And then trouble came from the south, the trouble Darren had both expected and feared. Smallpox crept into the barony via the trade route. The first to fall was the inn by the southern road. A week later, the disease had swept through 2 villages. People boarded up their homes and burned juniper at the crossroads. Darren unlocked the 3rd level and the entry about vaccination. The method was as old as time and as simple as a plow. Take pus from a cow's sore, inject it into a healthy person through a scratch.
catch a mild case of cow disease, and become immune to the Black Plague. He knew what people would say. Rubbing an animal's disease into children's blood. People were burned at the stake for that without any trial. So he had to start with himself. In front of his apprentices, Anselm and Verakund, who had been summoned specifically for this, Darren rolled up his sleeve and scratched his own shoulder with a needle dipped in cow pus from a farm where the milkmaids never contracted smallpox. Verakund asked why the master had called him to witness this madness. Darren replied that he had called him to witness a test. If, in a month, he fell ill with a fever, let the curia judge him as a poisoner. If, however, smallpox did not take him, let the curia conclude that it was no coincidence that the milkmaids, with their perpetual cow sores, did not contract smallpox. His shoulder swelled on the third day. A slight fever set in. The apprentices looked pale. Tobbs ranted and threatened to scratch his own arm so that the master wouldn't die alone. On the sixth day, the fever subsided, leaving only a small indentation on his shoulder. And 2 weeks later, Darren did something that made Anselm's hands tremble. He went to the infected inn to help nurse the sick. He visited the patients for 10 days. He did not fall ill. The news of this spread faster than any letter could. People began coming to the workshop and asking for a scratch. The first to arrive were the milkmaids from the farmstead, who weren't afraid of anything anyway. They were followed by parents from villages where funerals were already taking place. Verakund remained silent for a week, and then sent a short note. He wrote that the curia neither approved nor forbade it, and that he himself would come tomorrow with his 8-year-old nephew. Darren read the note 3 times. The investigator was entrusting him with the most precious thing he possessed. By the end of summer, smallpox had ravaged the neighboring lands and stopped at the border of the barony as if hitting a wall. No one died in the vaccinated villages. The death toll had surpassed 2,400. And at the end of summer, a messenger arrived in Regenholm wearing colors never before seen here, purple and gold, the king's colors. The messenger carried a sealed scroll for Baron Edwald and, on his own initiative, added a verbal message that had the whole town talking within an hour. At the court of King Albrecht, word had reached them of a land where the men worked twice as hard, yet famine bypassed the villages, and that the royal chancellor wished to know if this was true. The baron summoned Darren to the castle that very evening. He was cheerful and terrifying at the same time. He said that the master had grown into troubles that a commoner would be better off not knowing about, because the king might notice you from afar. But once the king notices you, he'll never be able to forget you. During the inquiry, Darren convinced Verakund to postpone the matter by proposing to print cheap prayer books under the supervision of the curia, and the workshop received a reprieve and then orders from the curia itself. During the smallpox epidemic, he inoculated himself with cowpox in front of witnesses, nursed the sick without falling ill himself, and the inoculations halted the plague at the border of the barony, raising the death toll above 2,400, and Verakund even brought his own nephew to be inoculated. A royal messenger arrived in Regenholm because King Albrecht's court had taken an interest in the land where the harvest had grown and the plague had receded. The scroll from the capital turned out to be not an order, but a question. Chancellor Hagenhoff, on behalf of the king, asked the baron whether the reports about the harvests, the machines, and the halted plague were true, and if true, by what means this had been achieved. Baron Edwald dictated his reply for 3 hours, wearing out the scribe. He praised his land, praised his own skill, and only at the very end mentioned the master who stood under his authority. Darren listened and understood the game. The baron wanted glory for himself and to keep the master in the shadows like a goose that lays golden eggs. This suited Darren more than the baron could have imagined. He needed that shadow. It was in the shadows that the machines were built. The reply was sent to the capital, and Darren returned to the task he now considered his primary focus, the steam engine. All autumn, the workshop lived and breathed this construction project. Time passed in flashes. Here, Tob and Jorgen were casting the cylinder in a clay mold.
The first two came out with cavities and cracks, but the third rang out cleanly under the hammer. Here, the apprentices were scraping the piston with lead files, their hands black up to the elbows. Here is Darren setting the boiler on riveted iron sheets and rearranging the firebox 3 times until the draft begins to hum evenly. Here, on the first frosty day, the machine comes to life. The balance beam swung. The rod descended into the shaft of the new, deep well. Water struck the trough in a thick, steady stream. The machine pumped as much water per shift as 40 workers could. The whole town gathered to watch the breathing iron. The guards at the gate abandoned their posts. Anselm printed a leaflet with a picture and an explanation that the machine was powered by steam, like the lid on a boiling pot, and that there was just as much magic here as there is in boiling soup. 1,000 copies of the leaflet were printed, and Darren ordered them to be distributed for free. He had long ago realized that fear can only be cured by understanding. The first major customer turned out to be someone from whom Darren least expected it. Cassius arrived from Oldenburg. The merchant had aged and no longer carried himself with his former charm. He stated bluntly that the guild had lost, that the scribes had been ruined by his efforts for nothing because the number of books hadn't decreased. It had increased tenfold, and his wagons were now transporting them. He said he preferred to go with the flow rather than against it, and that he wanted to buy 2 steam engines to pump water out of the salt mines near Oldenburg, where the water was eating away at half the yield. Darren named a price that made the scribe drop his pen. Cassius haggled until sunset and bought both. As he took his leave, he said without a smile that the master was wrong to think the worst was behind him. The guild had lost money, but there were those who had lost their pride, and that the Baron's nephew Raymond had been drinking in Oldenburg that winter with the entourage of Elector Sigmar, a neighbor and old enemy of Baron Edwald. And he had said there that his uncle had lost his mind, and that the land and the machines would soon change hands. Darren relayed this to the Baron word for word. The Baron's face turned ashen, but he said that Raymond was a fool and that his peace with the Elector was sealed by a charter. That winter, Cassius's machines were sent to Oldenburg with 2 apprentices for assembly and supervision. The price of salt rose, and with it, the workshop's reputation. The counter read 3,800. The tablet unlocked the 4th level on the night of the solstice. Darren sat in the storeroom, reading the list by the light of the screen. Direct current electric machine, wired telegraph, crucible steel, a lathe with a support, a hospital with antiseptics. He paused at the line about the lathe with a support and realized that this was the real key. Not a machine, but a machine that makes machines. A precision that no human hand could ever achieve. By spring, the lathe with a support stand was installed in the new stone workshop, and what Darren privately called the workshop's second birth began. Parts rolled off the line, identical as letters in a typewriter. One apprentice turned shafts, another cut threads, and a third assembled pumps without having to adjust each part to fit its place. In a week, they assembled what had previously taken a month. And in the spring, a second letter arrived from the capital. This time, it bore the Chancellor's personal seal, and the address was not to the Baron, but to Master Darren of Regenholm. Chancellor Haganoff wrote in a dry, intelligent tone. He wrote that the kingdom was counting every grain, for 2 consecutive years of poor harvests had emptied the granaries of the south. That the king was being told of miracles, but the Chancellor did not believe in miracles. He believed in machines. And that the master was to arrive in the capital for the autumn sem to demonstrate his machines before the king and the council. At the bottom was a postscript that made the Baron's cheek twitch. The Chancellor wrote that Baron Edwald's seal was an honor to the Baron, but that people like Master Darren, in the Crown's view, belonged to the kingdom. The Baron read the letter 3 times. Then he said quietly and bitterly that the Crown was reaching for his chicken. That one cannot refuse the king, but he had no intention of giving up what was his. And that they would travel to the capital together, and the master would say whatever the Baron needed him to say. Darren bowed and said nothing. Inside, however, he was already thinking otherwise.
100,000 people lived in the capital. The fifth level required 10,000 improved lives. And in the capital sat a power more fearsome than any baron or any elector. There, the archbishop and the holy consistory held court, for whom Veracun's inquiry was merely a distant echo. That evening, Veracund came of his own accord without being summoned. He now entered the workshop without hesitation and made prints at the communal table. But this time, his face was the same as it had been on his first day in the temple. He placed a letter before Darren from an old seminary classmate who served in the capital. The classmate wrote that the consistory had opened a file on the master from Regent Holm. That his father, Gregorius, the consistory's chief prosecutor, a man who had burned more books in the course of his service than others had transcribed, was compiling it. And that Gregorius was awaiting the master's arrival in the capital like a hunter waits for game in his own field. The workshop had built its first steam engine for water lifting, and Cassius had sided with Darren and bought 2 machines for the salt mines, but warned that Raymond was colluding with the people of Elector Sigmar. The counter reached 3,800. The 4th level opened, and the lathe with a support turned the workshop into a production facility with identical parts.
Chancellor Haganoff summoned Darren to the capital for the autumn diet, hinting that such people belonged to the crown, while Veracund learned that the chief prosecutor of the consistory, Father Gregorius, was compiling a dossier on Darren and awaiting his arrival. They set out for the capital in a large convoy after the harvest. The Baron took 20 of Gottfried's horsemen and his best suit.
Darren took Anselm Taub, 2 apprentices, and 3 carts loaded with machinery. He was transporting a small steam engine in disassembled form, a pump, a winnower, a machine with a support bracket, a stack of books, and a box of glass. He was also carrying something that even the Baron didn't know about. In his bag lay copper wires, coils, and machined parts for a machine that no one here had ever seen. The journey took 9 days. The capital came into view from the hill, a sea of rooftops and smoke. Darren looked at it and saw not grandeur, but misery. The suburbs were drowning in mud. Children played along the sewage ditches. Above the river, beneath the bridges, hung a stench that brought tears to one's eyes. A city of 100,000 souls drank from the very same river into which it discharged its waste. Darren recalled the well in Widemore and realized that what he was seeing was that same well, only 1,000 times larger. The same was to convene in a week, and that week was spent preparing. Chancellor Haganoff received them on the 2nd day. He was a small, gaunt man with eyes as quick as a bird's. For an hour, he questioned Darren about the machines and not once about miracles. He asked about the price of iron, the number of apprentices, and how much grain a winnower saved per 100 sacks. As they parted, he said quietly that the master would have 2 listeners at the same: the king, who loves all things new, and the archbishop, who hates all things new, and that it was not the king who needed convincing. The demonstration was held in the large courtyard of the arsenal. King Albrecht arrived, a young, portly, and bored man. Advisors, landowners, and military officers were present. Archbishop Boniface arrived, dressed in white and gold, and standing behind him was a tall monk with a face as narrow as a blade. Darren realized, without being told, that this was Gregory. The machines were demonstrated one by one. The winnower drew a murmur of approval from the landowners. The pump piqued the military's interest for siege operations, and Darren tensed inwardly but said nothing. A steam engine, assembled in 2 days in the arsenal courtyard, pumped water from the moat, and the king watched the panting balance wheel with his mouth agape, like a little boy. And then Darren brought to the table the very thing for which he had brought the copper and the coils: 2 boxes connected by a wire 100 paces apart. He called it a telegraph. Anselm stood by one of the boxes at the far end of the courtyard. Darren suggested that the king whisper any word secretly into his ear. The king smiled and whispered. Darren tapped out the message with a key. At the far end, Anselm read it on the telegraph tape and shouted the word "fair" across the courtyard. The courtyard gasped. The king clapped his hands.
He demanded that it be repeated 3 times with different words, and 3 times the word traveled along the wire faster than any messenger. In the ensuing silence, Darren recited his prepared words. A messenger rides for a day. The wire responds instantly. A kingdom with wires is a kingdom where the king's orders and news of disaster travel at the speed of thought. And then Archbishop Boniface rose to his feet. He did not shout. He spoke softly, and that softness sent a chill down one's spine. He asked how a lowly, fatherless apprentice of a wheelwright could know what not a single learned man in the kingdom knew. He asked why the plague had bypassed the lands where the master rubbed animal filth into children's skin, and whether a pact had been made here, one too terrible to speak of aloud. He said that the consistory had examined the master's books and found in the calendars calculations of the celestial bodies without a single error for years to come, something beyond the capacity of mortal understanding. The court fell silent. The king stopped smiling and looked at Darren with a new expression, one of wariness. Behind the archbishop's shoulder, Gregorius opened a leather folder.
And then a man stepped forward, a man Darren had neither summoned nor expected. Verakund. The investigator had arrived in the capital on his own accord, without warning anyone. He unfurled a document before the throne and spoke in a voice accustomed to the vaults of the temple. He said that he had conducted an investigation into Master Darren for a year and 2 months in strict accordance with the statutes. That he had examined every book and every rumor. That the glowing box turned out to be a piece of junk. The calculations of the celestial bodies were taken from monastic tables and merely pieced together with zeal, and that the beastly defilement had averted the plague from 8,000 souls, including the investigator's own nephew. That the Master Prince prayer book's cheaper than candles, and the Word of God has reached even the remotest village for the first time.
And that if the consistory wishes to judge the one who stopped the plague, let it first answer to heaven for those whom the plague will take tomorrow in lands where there are no vaccinations. Boniface and Verakund
Looked at each other across the courtyard. Then the king stood up. Albrecht was a man who was bored, but not foolish. He said that the Holy Fathers could debate the master's soul as much as they liked,
But the master's machines were needed by the crown now because the South was starving, the treasury was empty, and the neighbors were sharpening their knives. He announced his decision. Master Darren was granted a royal charter for the free manufacture of machines throughout the kingdom. The first priority was a cable from the capital to the southern granaries and machines for the royal shipyards. Baron Edwald was to receive thanks for training the master, as well as a share in the privilege. The court bowed. Boniface bowed with everyone else, but Darren saw his eyes. There was no defeat in those eyes. There was patience. That evening, they celebrated quietly in a house set aside for the occasion. The Baron was pleased with his share in the wine. Tob slept sitting up, and Darren went out with Verakund into the dark courtyard and asked why he had come and turned everything against the archbishop. Verakund was silent for a long time. Then he said that for 11 years he had sought heresy in the words of others and found the truth in their deeds, and that his nephew was alive. That night, Darren opened his tablet. The counter read 5,200. He was halfway to the 5th level, and toward morning there was a quiet knock on the shutter. Standing on the threshold was one of Cassius's men, covered in the dust of a 3-day journey. He had brought a letter consisting of 2 lines. Cassius wrote that Raymond had fled from the barony to Elector Sigmar, and that he had not taken any gold with him. He had taken the steam boiler blueprints stolen from the workshop and a young foundryman who knew how to cast cylinders. At a demonstration before King Albrecht, Darren showcased the machines and the telegraph, which delighted the court. However, Archbishop Boniface, along with the prosecutor Gregorius, attempted to frame the matter as heresy, and Darren was unexpectedly saved by Verakundus, who publicly attested to the findings of his investigation. The king granted Darren a royal charter for the free operation of his machines, along with an order for a telegraph line to the southern granaries, while the baron received a share and was satisfied.
the counter reached 5,200, and Cassius reported that Raymond had fled to Elector Z. Igmar, having stolen the steam boiler blueprints and poached the foundry man. In the morning, Darren brought Cassius's letter to the Baron. The Baron read it and turned ashen. He said he would strangle his nephew himself with the reins. Then he cooled down and began to calculate, as he had done all his life. The outlook was grim. Elector Sigmar held lands 3 times as rich as the barons, and an army 5 times as large. With the boiler blueprints and the foundrymen, he would have his machines within a year. And a man who steals once will bring war twice. Darren listened and kept his thoughts to himself. He thought the boiler was only half the trouble. A boiler without a machine tool, without a support, without lapping, and without coke would leak and explode. Knowledge lives not in a blueprint, but in the hands. But sooner or later, Sigmar would get his hands on it. So he had to run ahead faster than the thief could catch up. Darren spent the entire winter in the capital, and winter passed in a blur. Now, on the vacant lot behind the arsenal, the buildings of the royal workshops are going up, and Tob is driving the capital's foundryman, who at first called him a country bumpkin, but a month later were following him around like ducklings. Here, the first 40 telegraph poles stretch from the southern outpost over the hills, and boys run along the wires for days on end. Here, Anselm opens a school next to the workshops for 100 students, where they're taught arithmetic, drafting, and literacy for free. And the line of parents stretches from the gate to the bridge. Here, Darren lays out before the Chancellor a plan that has been maturing since his first day in the capital. Clean water and sewer pipes for the suburbs. Hagenoff looks at the estimate and says the treasury is empty. Darren replies that a plague in the capital would cost more, and proposes paying a third of the cost, with workshop machinery in installments against future taxes. The Chancellor thinks it over for a night and signs the agreement. By spring, the first steam-powered pumping station was delivering river water through sand filters to 6 city fountains. The suburbs drank clean water for the first time in their history. The counter climbed faster than ever before. 7,000, 8,500. During Holy Week, the tablet lit up in gold. 10,400. The 5th level opened with a list that took one's breath away.
A double-acting steam engine, a locomotive and railroad tracks, Bessemer steel, vaccines and the germ theory, an alternating current electric generator. Darren read the line about the locomotive and saw a map of the kingdom crisscrossed by iron threads along which bread from the south traveled to the starving north in 2 days instead of 3 weeks. But standing between him and that map was a war that he sensed like a thunderstorm behind the hills. In the summer, the storm flashed for the first time. A telegram arrived from the southern border. Elector Sigmar's advance parties had crossed the border river at the Holzweg Ford, burned 2 villages, and retreated. It was a test. That's how one tests the ice before stepping on it with one's full weight. The king convened a council, and Darren was summoned as the crown master. The military demanded cannons from him. Colonel Brandt, a man as straight as a ramrod, said that Sigmar's foundries had been casting gun barrels for half a year already, and that the master was obligated to provide the crown with weapons superior to those of the enemy. Everyone looked at Darren. He stood up and said what he had decided for himself on that very first day, with the drawing board in his hands. He said he did not make weapons and would not make them. The council buzzed with discussion. Brandt asked whether the master considered himself entitled to choose when the kingdom was in danger. Darren replied with a question of his own. He asked why more soldiers were dying, from cannonballs or from contaminated water, bad food, and gangrene in the supply trains. Brandt faltered. Every military man knew the answer. For every death caused by iron, there were 4 from fever and infection. Darren continued. He would give the army what would make it stronger than any cannon. Field water filters, canned food that wouldn't spoil for a year. Hospitals maintained a strict hygiene standards where the wounded survived 4 times as often. A telegraph line all the way to the border so orders could travel instantly, and a railroad to the south so that the army and the grain could move faster than the enemy could figure out where they were. Hagen was the first to understand and the first to nod. "Wars are won with feet and stomachs," said the chancellor. The king approved everything and added of his own accord that the master was a cunning man, the likes of whom the world had never seen, because he had strengthened the army without getting his hands dirty. Brant approached the council on his own afterward. He said he disagreed and that he would remember it, but he extended his hand. A year after that council meeting, Darren recalled it as the hardest and fastest year of his life. Here, the first 100 fathoms of track are being laid on the embankment beyond the southern outpost, and a locomotive assembled in the new workshops is pulling 5 loaded cars amid the whistles and howls of the crowd, while engineer Tobbs selected apprentices like a priest. Here, the canning factory rolls out the first 10,000 cans of stewed meat, and soldiers on trial rations first spit them out in disbelief, but then ask for seconds. Here, at the field hospital, antiseptics are deployed during maneuvers in accordance with regulations, and the old doctors rebel against washing their hands until Brant lines them up in formation. Here, the wire reaches the southern fortress of Eisenberg, and the commandant sends the first one-word telegram. "We stand." The counter read 18,000, and in the fall, the storm struck with full force. That night, a loud crash at the gate roused Darina from his bed. Standing on the threshold was a communications officer clutching a telegraph tape in his fist. The dispatch from the south was long and terrifying. Elector Sigmar had crossed the border with 3 columns totaling up to 20,000 men. Eisenberg had been bypassed and was under siege. Advanced patrols were burning the granaries, and the final line made Darren's jaw clench. In the enemy's supply train, they had spotted wheeled steam engines pulling siege guns. Raymond wasn't sitting idle with the Elector. Over the winter in the capital, the royal workshops, Anselm's school, a telegraph line, and a water supply system with filters for the suburbs had been built, after which the counter exceeded 10,000, and the 5th level was unlocked, featuring a locomotive, steel, and vaccines. At the War Council, Darren refused to manufacture weapons but provided the army with filters, canned food, antiseptics, field hospitals, and a telegraph system, and began building a railroad to the south, thereby convincing the king and the chancellor, although Colonel Brant remained opposed. In the fall, Elector Sigmar invaded with 20,000 troops, laid siege to the fortress of Eisenberg, and steam locomotives built with Ryman's help were spotted in his supply train. By dawn, Darren was at the palace. The council was in session by candlelight. On the table lay a map of the south, pinned down with pins. It appeared that the king's army would be fully mobilized in 12 days, while Eisenberg, by all estimates, could hold out for 8. If the fortress fell, the road to the capital would be open, and Sigmar would have the entire winter to negotiate with a knife to the king's throat. Brant stood over the map, his face sallow from sleeplessness. He said a miracle was needed, but he didn't believe in miracles. Just then, Darren approached the map and placed his finger on the thin double line running south from the capital. The railroad had been completed up to the Gravenfeld junction, 2/3 of the way to the fortress. He said the army wouldn't need to march for 12 days. The First Corps, along with supplies and locomotives, would be transported to Gravenfeld in a day and a half. From there, it was 3 stages to Eisenberg. The army would arrive at the fortress on the 5th day, while Sigmar would be waiting for it on the 12th. The council fell silent. Brant asked again about the number of rail cars, the weight of the cannons, and the water supply for the engines. Darren answered with figures because he had been preparing them all year. The colonel straightened up and told the king that if the master wasn't lying, the war would be won before the first shot was fired. He added quietly that he was taking back what he had said after that council meeting. What followed were 5 days that people later recounted as a legend. Here at the capital's train station, regiments are being loaded into rail cars, and horses brace themselves against the iron beast until they are led away blindfolded. Here, all 7 locomotives shuttle back and forth day and night, and Taub himself stands at the repair shop in Gravenfeld,
gaunt and happy. Here, the telegraph reports the movement of each column, and Brandt dictates orders, looking at the telegraph tape as if it were the enemy's cards laid face up. Here, the Corps advances toward Eisenberg at dawn on the 5th day, into the rear of the besieging camp. Darren neither saw nor wanted to see what had happened beneath the walls. The dispatches were enough for him. Sigmar, caught between the fortress and a fresh army with fully loaded supply trains, fought a single battle, lost the siege park, and retreated toward the border.
Ryman's steam tractors fell into Brandt's hands intact.
The colonel wrote in his dispatch that their boilers were leaking at every seam, and that a captured foundry worker had wept and begged to be sent back to the workshops. The war ended in 3 weeks. Sigmar requested peace, surrendered the border fords, and handed over the fugitives. Raymond was brought to the capital in shackles, and Darren did not appear for trial. Baron Edwald went and returned in silence. His nephew faced life imprisonment in a fortress. The capital welcomed the army with the ringing of bells. And then something happened that Darren feared more than defeat. They carried him on their shoulders. The crowd lifted him from his horse at the train station and carried him along. And above their heads he heard the same word over and over. Messenger. Messenger. At the cathedral, the procession came to a halt, and people began to drop to their knees. Not before the cathedral, but before him. Darren stood on the shoulders of strangers above the kneeling crowd and felt a chill run down his spine. He jumped down. He lifted people off their knees with his own hands and told them that he was a master, not a saint, that machines were made of iron, and that iron had been mined by people just like them. They listened to him with rapture, but did not hear him. That evening, Verican came to his home. He was now the printing censor at the workshops by royal decree. He said bluntly that things were looking bad, that preachers of a new sort had appeared in the suburbs, calling themselves the children of progress, that they read the Premier as if it were a holy book and taught that the old God was dead and the new one walked around in a leather apron, that the consistory was gathering evidence, and this time Boniface wouldn't have to make anything up. The heresy was real, and Darren himself, by his very existence, gave it its name. Darren listened and realized that against this enemy, he had neither a blueprint nor a machine. A crowd cannot be repaired like a wheel. A week later, the archbishop summoned him. Darren expected threats, but he was wrong. Boniface received him alone without Gregorius. The old man looked tired. He said that for 30 years he had maintained order and had seen how that order cracked, not because of the machines, but because of the hope the machines had given. He said that the crowd would create a god for itself out of the master, whether the master wanted it or not, and that the master had only one way to avoid becoming a god, to become a teacher. God is one and unreachable. There are many teachers, and each is mortal. He proposed an agreement that left Darren speechless. The church would consecrate the schools and workshops throughout the kingdom and proclaim from the pulpits that knowledge is a gift from God given to all, and that the master is merely the first student
Among students. In return, the master would open schools at every cathedral and pass on everything he knew to the teachers. Let him become not the source of miracles, but one of 1,000 who carry the flame. Then the children of progress would have nothing to worship. Darren walked home through the city at night, thinking that the old fox had offered him something he himself had not dared to dream of. 1,000 schools. He agreed that morning. In the winter, the great teaching began.
Iwith Srizami. Now, in 30 cities, schools are opening at the cathedrals, and Anselm is printing textbooks by the hundreds of thousands of sheets. Now, the first 100 graduates of the workshops are setting out as teachers, and Darren bids farewell to each one, shaking their hand. Now the preachers of the Children of Progress are trying to hold meetings, but yesterday's listeners reply that there are no miracles, only a pump. And here is its blueprint in a penny-a-page booklet. The sect melted away like ice in April. The counter read 47,000, and the tablet unlocked the 6th level. Darren read the first line and sat down on the storeroom floor. Internal combustion engine,
radio communication, electrification of cities, anesthesia, and open-heart surgery. The number stood at 100,000 until the 7th level. And at the end of winter, a telegram arrived that changed everything once again.
The telegraph operator received it at night from the southern coastal station and ran with it. In the port of Seehafen, 6 ships had dropped anchor, flying flags unknown to anyone on the coast. The ships had come from across the ocean. And the people from the ships, speaking broken trade language, asked only one thing at the port. They asked where to find the man who brings iron to life.
Via the railroad and telegraph, Brandt's army reached the rear of the siege of Eisenberg in 5 days, routed Sigmar, and the war ended in 3 weeks, while Raimund was handed over and sentenced to life in a fortress.
After the triumph, the crowd began to worship Darren. A sect called the Children of Progress emerged, and Archbishop Boniface, instead of a trial, proposed an agreement whereby the church would consecrate the schools and Darren would disseminate knowledge through 1,000 teachers, which dissolved the sect.
The counter reached 47,000. The 6th level opened, featuring radio technology and surgery, and 6 overseas ships arrived at the port of Seehafen, whose crews were searching for the man who brings iron to life.
Darren set out for Seehafen 2 days later with a small entourage and the king's permission. Hagen gave him a brief send-off. The chancellor said that the ships from across the ocean were either the greatest trade deal in the kingdom's history or a reconnaissance mission prior to an invasion, and that the master must determine which of the two it was. The journey took 6 days, and on the 7th, Darren saw the sea for the first time in both of his lives at once. And in the roadstead lay 6 ships unlike any built here. Narrow, long hulls. 3 tiers of gaff sails. Dark wood planking fastened with bronze. The guests had been living in the harbor on their ships for a month and had come ashore only in small numbers. A reception was held at the harbor master's house. The guests were introduced by a man of about 60, with skin the color of dark copper and completely white hair. He identified himself as Tahar, an envoy of the Ashanti Maritime League, an alliance of free cities on the western coast of the overseas continent. He had a firm grasp of the trade language, though he pronounced the words in his own way. Tahar spoke plainly, without any courtly frills. His land is rich, gold, copper, cotton, mahogany, spices. But his land is ravaged by a swamp disease that kills 1 in every 3 children. And his land is torn apart by wars between cities over water, because the rivers are running dry and the fields are withering. 3 years ago, a ship carrying northern merchants arrived at their port and brought a cheap picture book, Anselm's alphabet. On the last page was a drawing of a pump, with a caption stating that it was made in the workshops of Darien in the kingdom of Albrecht. The League Council spent 3 years gathering information. Then it equipped 6 ships. Tahar placed a gold ingot the size of a brick on the table and said that this was not payment, but a deposit for a conversation. The League does not need goods. The League needs the workshops themselves. It needs the teachers, the machines, the books, and the man who knows how to set it all in motion. Darren listened, and something happened inside him that he later couldn't put into words. He suddenly saw the tablet in a new light. The counter had never spoken of the kingdom. The counter had spoken of people, just people, no matter where they lived. He asked about the disease of the swamps. Tahar described it, fever coming in waves every other day, shivering, a yellowish tinge. Darren recognized malaria from the textbooks of his former life and kept a straight face. On the 6th level, in the section on medicine, he had seen a line about cinchona bark and draining stagnant water. The cure for their greatest affliction lay right there under his shirt. The negotiations lasted 9 days. Darren sent a telegram to the capital every day, and the capital replied cautiously.
Hagenhoff was afraid to share knowledge across the ocean. The military feared ships. The merchants were both afraid and eager at the same time. The king wavered.
Then Darren requested a private audience over the wire and dictated to the telegraph operator the longest message in the history of the line. he wrote to the king that knowledge cannot be held back any more than water can be held back by a sieve, and that Raymond had already proven this. That the question is not whether other lands will learn about the machines. The question was whether they would accept them as a gift from the kingdom or steal them as plunder. That knowledge given as a gift breeds friends and trade, while knowledge stolen breeds sigmars. And that he proposed not to hand over the workshops, but to plant their seed across the ocean on the crown's terms. Joint workshops. Half the profits go to the kingdom. The masters travel under a 5-year contract. The trade route across the ocean is secured under Albrecht's flag. The reply arrived a day later and was brief. The king wrote that the master had once already haggled an entire courtyard out of him while standing in the middle of the throne room, and that the king was tired of arguing with him. Consent was granted. The treaty with the Ashanti League was signed in the chief's house in 2 languages. After signing, Tahar stood up and bowed Dadarn to the ground, and then did something that left the port clerks speechless. He said that the League's council had authorized him, as a last resort, to surrender all 6 ships and their cargo in exchange for such a treaty. But the treaty turned out to be more honorable than that last resort. Therefore, he simply added the ships to his word as a sign that the League's word is unwavering. In the spring, the first expedition set sail across the ocean. 12 teachers from among the graduates, a disassembled steam engine, a printing press, tons of books. Crates of cinchona bark purchased through southern merchants at Darren's behest, and Anselm. The librarian volunteered first, and Darren tried to talk him out of it for a week, but then hugged him and let him go. Darren would remember that farewell at the pier for the rest of his life. Anselm stood at the stern holding the very first primer, the one with the dog-eared corners, high above his head. The year following their departure passed in flashes. Now the telegraph network has closed into a ring connecting all the major cities of the kingdom, and stock prices are synchronized within a day instead of a month. In the capital, the first 100 electric streetlights powered by a 6th-level generator were lit, and people from the villages flocked to the square to see the lights as if it were a fair. The first open-heart surgery under general anesthesia was performed at the Royal Hospital, and the old surgeon Moltko wept in the hallway because he had spent 40 years cutting into living flesh. Then, bitter news arrives from the south that Baron Edwald has died in his sleep at his castle, and Darren travels to the funeral and stands by the coffin of the man who first granted him a court and a seal. The counter had passed 70,000. And in the fall, the first ship returned from across the ocean. It brought gold, cotton, letters of thanks from the League Council, and a 20-page letter from Anselm. Anselm wrote that schools had been established in 4 cities of the League, that the cinchona bark had reduced the mortality rate from swamp fever by a factor of 3, and mothers were bringing their children to the school gates as if to altars, that the pumps had brought water to the parched fields, and the 2 cities that had fought over the river had harvested a crop without bloodshed for the first time in 100 years. And that on the mainland, beyond the mountains, lie other countries and other peoples, and they are all looking at the League's smoking chimneys. At the end of the letter was a line that left Darren sitting motionless for a long time. Anselm wrote that he now understood why the heavens had given people the ocean, so that man might learn that goodness has no shores. That very night, the tablet vibrated. The counter read 101,000. The screen flashed with 7th-level gold and went dark for a moment. Then it lit up again and displayed something Darren had never seen before. Not a list. A single line filling the entire screen. The final level. One technology remained to unlock. To gain access, improve the lives of 1 million people. Ash-Shanti Tahar, the envoy of the Overseas League, arrived seeking workshops and knowledge, and Darren convinced the king that knowledge given freely creates allies, while stolen knowledge creates enemies. They then signed an agreement for joint workshops with the crown, holding a share. The expedition, with Anselm, the teachers, the machines, and the cinchona bark, set sail across the ocean and returned a year later with news that the schools were standing. The disease had receded, and the 2 warring nations had reconciled by the water.
Baron Edwald died. The counter had exceeded 100,000, and the tablet unlocked the final level with a single locked technology requiring 1 million enhanced lives. 1 million. Darren had been carrying that number around for a week, like a stone tucked under his shirt. The entire kingdom of Albrecht numbered 2 million souls. The Ashanti League added another 1.5 million. 1 million enhanced lives meant that nearly every home on both sides of the ocean would need to be reached. He didn't know what lay beyond the last line and forbade himself from speculating. But he knew something else. The path to 1 million did not lie in a new machine. All the machines already existed. The path lay in an order that would allow the machines to reach everyone. And Darren sat down to write a document that would later be called the Charter of the Workshops. He spent a month writing it. The result was simple and unprecedented. The workshops in every city would be united into a single brotherhood with a common fund, common textbooks, and common rules. Every master was required to train 3 apprentices. Every third penny earned would go toward the school and hospital in his city. Blueprints are not hidden, but are printed. The title of master is granted not by birth or wealth, but by passing an exam before the guild. After reading it, Hagenhoff said that a master was building a second kingdom within the kingdom. Darren replied that he was laying the foundation for the first. The king approved the charter with some reluctance, on the condition that Verekund remain the guild's printing censor and that the royal auditor be given a seat on the joint treasury committee. Darren agreed immediately, because transparency was more important to him than freedom. The guild grew faster than he dared to hope. In 2 years, by leaps and bounds. Now 40 cities are swearing allegiance to the charter. And on the guild gates, next to the royal eagle, the brotherhood's emblem, a gear and an ear of grain, is raised. For the first time, a woman, Greta, the widow of a foundryman, passes the master craftsman's exam. After her husband's death, she ran his workshop better than his living competitors, and half the examination committee stands as the results are announced, while the other half writes a complaint to the king, and the king tears up the complaint. Here, in the mountainous districts, 400 elementary schools open at once, and there aren't enough teachers, so retired telegraph operators and Brandt's literate soldiers step in to teach. Now, the Brotherhood's hospitals are delivering babies with clean hands and trained midwives, and for the first time in history, parish records show that fewer women died in childbirth in a year than the number of twins born. The counter crept along. 200,000. 300. The numbers no longer jumped. Each new 100,000 came more slowly than the last, because the easy part had been done, and the hard part remained. The distant villages, the mountain hamlets, and the neighboring lands where the Brotherhood was reluctant to venture. And then help came from the one from whom Darren had not expected it. Archbishop Boniface died.
The old man had been fading for a long time, and a week before the end, he summoned Darren to his side. Darren arrived and sat by the bedside of the man who had once nearly handed him over to Gregory. Boniface spoke slowly and soberly. He said that he was departing in peace because he had been mistaken, for the better. He had thought that knowledge would destroy faith, but knowledge had purged fear from faith and left only light. He said that he had dictated his will, and that the church schools would come under the Brotherhood's general charter forever. And then he asked Darren for one last favor. He asked that someday, wherever the master might eventually end up, he would remember the old man who had been afraid at first. Darren did not understand those words at the time. He understood them later. The council elected Verekundus as the new archbishop. The capital gasped, but Darren did not. He had seen this path coming for a long time. The former investigator took holy orders and, in his first sermon, declared that ignorance was henceforth considered a sin of despondency, for man is endowed with reason, and Scripture forbids burying that gift in the ground. From pulpits across the country, priests began to read not only prayers, but also vaccination schedules. Progress was made where neither money nor orders. And from across the ocean, Anselm's letters arrived with every ship, and each one was a chapter of a book one wanted to read aloud. The League brought an end to the water wars with pumps and canals. Beyond the mountains, kingdoms opened up that had never been heard of here,
and caravans carried books in 3 languages to those lands. Anselm wrote that he had translated the alphabet into 8 dialects, and that among one mountain people, the letters were carved into bamboo, because paper was expensive, and he was sending a sample. By the end of the 5th year of the charter, the counter showed 600,000. And then Darren did something no one expected of him. He convened a grand council of the Brotherhood and announced that he was leaving the capital. The council was stunned. Darren explained calmly, the capital no longer needed him. The machines are running, the schools are teaching, and the finances are transparent. But he is needed where the counter stands, in the distant lands where no road has yet reached. He's taking 3 train cars full of tools, 20 volunteers, and heading to a place where no one knows him. Because the true test isn't where craftsmen are carried on people's shoulders. The test is where he'll be met as a stranger. He set out in the spring, first along the rails to the end of the tracks, then along the highway to the end of the highway, then along the back roads to the end of the back roads. Beyond the back roads lay the lands of the Principality of Morvan, a remote forested region wedged between mountains, where there were neither telegraph wires nor the printed word, and where Prince Radborn held fast to tradition more firmly than fortress walls. At the Principality's outpost, the convoy was stopped by spearmen. The senior officer looked at the locomobile pulling the cars along the road as if it were a... Darren stepped forward and said that he was a master craftsman, transporting machines, books, and doctors, and asked the prince for permission to work. The commander replied that they had heard of the master here, that the prince's seer had declared him to be one who steals souls through iron. He added that entry was forbidden to him, and that in the principality, one was flogged for printed words. The outpost gates closed. Darren stood before the closed gates and smiled to himself. 20 volunteers looked at him with concern. He turned to them and said that at last they had arrived where they needed to be. Darren established a charter for a guild of workshops with a common fund, schools, and examinations, thanks to which knowledge spread far and wide, and Greta became the first female master. On his deathbed, Boniface bequeathed the church schools to the Brotherhood, but Verikind became the new archbishop, declaring ignorance a sin, and the count reached 600,000 as Anselm's letters arrived regarding the end of the overseas wars. Darren left the capital and led the volunteers to the remote principality of Morven, where the prince and the sorcerer declared that he was a thief of souls and closed the gates before him. Darren did not storm the gates, neither by force nor by appealing to the king, though he could have. A single dispatch, and Albrecht would have pressed the prince with the full weight of the crown. But Darren knew the price of coerced consent. It lasts only until the first departure. He led his caravan to the royal side of the border, to the last village near the outpost, and ordered his men to set up camp for the long haul. The plan was as simple as plowing a field. If he couldn't go to the people, let the people come to him. The village of Craney Bor lived off border trade and lived meagerly. Darren started there. He set up a pump by the well. He opened a school in the granary for 20 children. He set up a medical tent where the Brotherhood's medic treated everyone for free. And trade crossed the border. The Morvenians brought honey, resin, and furs to the royal side. And they had eyes. They saw the column from which water flowed on its own. They heard the border children reading aloud, and they carried what they had seen home along with their salt. The first to cross the border was a Morven beekeeper with an abscess on his arm that was turning it black. The prince's shaman treated him with incantations for 9 days, and on the 10th day, the beekeeper rode through the border post to die among strangers out of despair. The medic lanced the abscess, cleaned it out, and a week later, the beekeeper was moving his arm as freely as a young man. He returned home and did not keep silent. Others followed in the beekeeper's footsteps. Women in labor who were brought in secretly at night. Woodcutters with broken bones. An old woman blinded by cataracts whose sight was restored in a quarter of an hour by a surgeon summoned from the capital at Darren's request, and who, upon leaving, kissed not the man's hands but the doorframe of the tent. Every person who was cured left for the principality as a living advertisement. Prince Radborn held out for half a year. The sorcerer demanded that the border be closed entirely, but closing the border meant stifling trade, and the princely treasury depended on trade. So the sorcerer took a different approach. In Craney Bor, the school caught fire at night.
The barn burned to the ground, along with the books and desks. In the morning, the entire village and 20 volunteers stood among the ashes, and Darren ordered them not to search for the arsonists but to clear away the embers. By noon, the Morvans began arriving from across the border. In silence, with axes and hewn logs. The first to arrive was a cooper with his entire family. 40 more people followed him. They spent 3 days building a new school right next to the ruins of the old one, and the new one turned out to be twice as large. And on the last day, a man arrived whom no one had expected, the young Prince Eric, Radborn's only son. He arrived in simple clothes with a stranger's wagon train, but Darren recognized him by his hands, which had never held an axe. The prince took Darren aside and spoke without preamble. He said that his father was old, the seer was greedy, and the principality was decaying. That, beyond the mountains, he had seen a fair with electric lights and had not slept since. That he asked to be taken on as a student in secret, as a commoner. And that, when his time came, he would open the gates himself. Darren looked at the prince for a long time. Then he replied that he did not take secret students because knowledge acquired under the table leaves a bitter taste. But that one could study without calling himself a prince's son. Let Eric enroll in the Brotherhood School in the nearby royal city, under any name, pass the exams like everyone else, and return not as a conspirator, but as a master. A conspiracy breaks down the gates. A master ensures that the gates open from the inside with a bow. Eric left in a rage, and a month later, Darren was informed that a certain young Morvanite, whose hands had never held an axe, had enrolled in the city school under a false name. The next 2 years flew by. Now Craney Bor, once a meager village, has become a fairground where half of Morven converges, and the border school now offers evening classes for adult Morvenians who trade by day and practice writing by night, breaking their styluses. The medical tent has grown into a log hospital with 40 beds, and half the nurses there are Morvenian girls trained right here. Here, Eric takes the journeyman's exam, ranking 8th out of 120, and Darren, sitting on the examination board, makes no indication, as recorded in the minutes, that he knows him. Then a sorcerer declares that outsiders are bringing a plague upon the bees, and, as if on purpose, the bees die off. But Darren sends the Brotherhood's beekeepers, who find mites in the hives, and teach the beekeepers how to fumigate. And the bees recover, and people trust the sorcerer even less. And in the 3rd year, Prince Radborn died. Eirik returned home for the funeral, no longer in secret. He entered the ancestral hall wearing his guild journeyman's diploma over his mourning robe, and the council of elders stirred with commotion. The sorcerer demanded that he renounce the iron defilement, and then Eric did what people later sang about in Morven. He went out into the square before the people, set up the pump he had brought over the old town well, and pulled the lever himself. Water began to flow. He told the people that this was the extent of the defilement, and that everyone could come forward, taste the water, and decide for themselves. The line to the pump stretched until dark. A month later, the young prince opened the border and sent Darren a letter containing a single line. The gates are open from the inside. Darren rode into Morven in the spring without an escort. He was not greeted on bended knee. He was greeted as one greets a kind neighbor returning from a journey. And that was the best reward for 3 years spent at closed gates. Following Morven's example, other disputed lands also opened up. Mountain clans, river tribes, eastern principalities where the Brotherhood had never ventured before. Everywhere, the same patient approach worked. Don't force your way in. Stand beside them. Heal, teach, and wait until curiosity overcomes fear. The tally kept rising. 800,000. 900. Darren turned 34.
He caught himself noticing that Tob's temples were completely gray, that Verakund had been serving as archbishop for 10 years now, and that the students of his first students were taking on students of their own. And then one autumn evening at the Morven Hospital, where he was inspecting the new wards, a telegram from the coast caught up with him, transmitted over the wire that he himself had once laid. The telegram was from Anselm, who had returned from across the ocean for good. Anselm wrote that he was sailing home and bringing guests with him. The Council of the Ashanti League and the embassies of the 7 overseas kingdoms are calling for a grand council of all the lands where the Brotherhood exists. They wish to sign a common charter of knowledge for all peoples at once. And the last line, Anselm wrote that he had tallied the lists of schools, hospitals, and workshops on both shores. And that if the council takes place and the charter is signed, the number of people whose lives are transformed will exceed 1 million in a single day. Rejected by Prince Morven, Darren set up camp near the border and, through the healing services of merchants, a school, and a hospital, won the trust of the Morvanians, who, after the school was set ablaze, rebuilt it themselves, making it even larger than before. Prince Eric, on Darren's advice, openly trained within the Brotherhood. Upon inheriting power, he opened the border from within by installing a pump in the square, after which other closed lands followed Morven's example. The counter reached 900,000, and Anselm, returning from across the ocean, reported that the embassies of the overseas kingdoms were requesting a grand council to sign a common charter of knowledge, which would instantly push the counter past 1 million. The grand council was scheduled for the fall in the capital. Preparations lasted half a year, and for half a year, Darren was restless. He knew the significance of the final stage, but did not know its contents. The tablet remained silent. The line of the final level glowed steadily and wouldn't open even a hair's breadth. Sometimes at night, he caught himself feeling a fear he hadn't even experienced during interrogation. He was afraid that behind the final line, there would be nothing but emptiness, a beautiful period with no continuation. And then he would drive that fear away with work. The capital was being rebuilt for the assembly. Here are the cross-sections. Here, above the train station, they're erecting Jorgen's glass vault, under which 3 trains could stand at once, and embassy visitors step out of the cars with their heads tilted back. Here, the Brotherhood's printers are publishing the Charter of Knowledge in 11 languages, and Verakund personally proofreads every translation, surrounded by dictionaries piled up like a fortress wall. Here, Greta, now head of the Foundry District, is casting a bell for the cathedral from the first Bessemerovian steel, and its sound is as clear and long-lasting as no other bronze. Here, Brant, aged but as upright as ever, is drawing up the cathedral's security schedule with an expression as if he were preparing the defense of a fortress, and he grumbles that keeping the peace is harder than waging war. Embassies had been arriving for a month. The Ashanti League, led by the gray-haired Tahar, who embraced Darren on the platform as if he were his own son. 7 overseas kingdoms in garments so dazzling they made one's eyes water. Morven with the young Prince Eirik. Mountain clans, river tribes, eastern princes, and southern sultanates, all who had made their way here via caravans. King Albrecht, who had grown heavier and gone bald, walked among the guests as the guest of honor, for the council had convened on his land and during his reign. Hagen, completely withered by old age, whispered to Darren that he had spent his final years in boredom, but now dying had become interesting. The council opened in the capital's largest hall under electric light. For 3 days, they read the charter article by article and debated. They argued over the share of the common treasury, the language of the exams, and whose measures and weights to adopt as the standard. Darren hardly intervened in the debates. He sat and watched as people speaking 11 different languages quarreled, not about whether to go to war, but about how to divide up the textbooks. And he thought that for the sake of this spectacle alone, it had been worth living both of his lives. On the 4th day, the charter was signed. There were 49 signatures. When the last ambassador affixed his seal, the hall rose to its feet, and Greta's bell rang out over the Capitol for the first time. Darren stood amid the general clamor and felt a steady warmth beneath his shirt.
He didn't look at the screen in front of everyone. He sat through the end of the celebrations, said the required words, and hugged those he was supposed to hug. And only after midnight did he lock himself in his old storage room next to the first workshops, which he had kept exactly as it was. The counter read 1,060,000. The last line glowed gold. Open. Darren touched it with a finger that suddenly refused to obey him. The screen unfolded, and Darren read the name of the latest technology in the entire repository: liquid fuel rocket engine and the fundamentals of orbital flight. He sat motionless for a very long time. Then he began to scroll through the file for terminades in the pages. The blueprints spanned hundreds of screens, combustion chambers, fuel vapors, thrust and trajectory calculations, metallurgy of alloys that local science was still 50 years away from developing. This was knowledge not meant for tomorrow. It was knowledge for the future, for a generation, or even two. And beneath the last blueprint was something that wasn't found beneath any of the others. Text. A simple, unsigned letter. Darren read it, and his hands trembled. It was written by the creator of the vault. He wrote that the device had been assembled in a world that had learned to fly to the stars, but had nearly destroyed itself along the way, because technology there always outpaced kindness. That the repository was built as an experiment and as a hope. It was designed so that the knowledge within it would be unlocked only through improved lives. So that strength and goodness would grow intertwined, like a gear and an ear of grain. That many such devices have been sent to different worlds and times, and most have likely been lost to nothing. And that if anyone is reading these lines, it means the experiment succeeded at least once. Darren reread the last paragraph 10 times. The creator wrote that the rocket engine was placed last not for flight. It was placed there as a question. A world that has raised its eyes to the stars will either remain a world where the counter is no longer needed because caring for people has become its very nature, or it will never raise them at all. And that, with this line, the repository will require nothing more and verify nothing further. From there on, it's up to you. The screen flickered. The counter vanished. Forever. All that remained were the blueprints, all open at once, from the plow to the rocket. Darren stepped out of the storeroom as dawn broke. The sun was rising over the Capitol. Smoke rose from the workshop chimneys. Telegrams raced along the wires. Somewhere across the ocean, a school bell rang to signal the start of class. He stood in the middle of the courtyard where, 20 years ago, he had repaired his first mill, and he realized that what he was holding in his hands wasn't a chest of blueprints. He was holding an exam, and the exam had just ended. And a week later, when the embassies had departed and the Capitol had celebrated itself out, Darren gathered his closest friends in the old storeroom. Tauba, Verakunda, Anselma, Greta, and Eirik, who had come to say goodbye. And he did what he had decided on that very first night. He laid the tablet on the table in front of everyone, and he told them everything. From the very beginning, from a stranger's life, from a foreign world, from a blow to the ribs on a straw mattress. He spoke for 2 hours, and no one interrupted him. When he fell silent, Taub was the first to speak. The old blacksmith looked at the glowing screen, then at Darren, and said that he'd known from the very first anvil strike that the boy wasn't from around here. Because the people here don't believe in others that way. Verakund remained silent longer than anyone else. Then he stood up, walked over to the tablet, and didn't touch it. He said that for 30 years, he'd been searching for a miracle, and here it was, lying on the table. And that the miracle wasn't in the box. The box was just counting. The miracle was that the count matched. At a grand assembly in the capital of the 49 lands on both sides of the ocean, they signed a common charter of knowledge, and the counter passed 1 million, unveiling the latest technology, a rocket engine, along with a letter from the repository's creator. The creator explained that the tablet was an experiment in combining power with kindness through improved lives, that the engine was intended as a test of the world's maturity, and that the counter would now disappear while all the blueprints would be open to the public forever. Darren revealed the truth about himself and the tablet to his inner circle, and Tob Verkund and the others accepted it, acknowledging that the miracle lay not in the device but in the converging count. After the council, Darren lived another 41 years, and the country later came to call those years the Long Morning. He was no longer in a hurry to go anywhere, for there was no longer any need to rush. The work took care of itself. He returned to Regenholm to the old courtyard by the southern gate, and the workshop once again became his home. He distributed the capital's offices among his students. The Brotherhood Council met without him and made sound decisions, for the charter had been written in the blood of all past mistakes. Darren administered exams, taught the first-year students, and on Thursdays would stand at the lathe himself so that his hands would not forget the truth of metal. The years passed in flashes, just like his entire life. Anselm completed the magnum opus of his life, a 6-volume history of the great teaching, and died a year after the final volume, quietly at his writing desk with a quill in his hand. He was buried on 2 continents at once because the schools overseas had erected a white stone cenotaph in his honor. Then there was Tob, who worked until he was 80 and left the forge only when the hammer became heavier than his pride. For another 5 years, he sat on a bench by the furnace, and the young foundryman whispered that as long as the old man was watching, the metal didn't dare to bubble. Then there was Verkund, who retired from his professorship and returned to Regenholm, and the 2 old men would sit on the workshop porch every other day, drinking herbal tea and arguing about the soul of machines until the stars appeared overhead. Greta became the first woman to head the guild council, and no one wrote complaints anymore because a generation had grown up for whom the exam was closer to their hearts than their family tree. Darren had 2 sons and a daughter with his wife Ilsa, the daughter of that very miller, Oswald, whom he had married at the age of 40, to the delight of the entire barony. The eldest son became a doctor. The younger one became a traveler. And his daughter, Martha, inherited her father's skill with her hands and his restlessness. And one day she came to him with a notebook full of calculations and asked about the last line of the vault's records, because the tablet had long since ceased to be a secret. After that night in the storeroom, Darren showed the creator's letter to the Council of the Brotherhood and then published it openly, omitting only the mention of other worlds, a decision the council deemed wise. The world knew that the knowledge had come from a repository gathered somewhere far away, and that the repository was measured not by gold, but by goodness. The world accepted this calmly. It turned out that where the fire came from wasn't all that important to people. What mattered was that the fire warmed everyone. Darren didn't hide the rocket blueprints, but he didn't rush to share them either. He handed them over to the Brotherhood's highest school as a long-term project. During his lifetime, they managed to build only small experimental chambers that roared on test stands outside the city, scaring away the crows. Darren would go to watch the tests as an old man, leaning on a cane, and the young engineers didn't know what he saw in that roar. But he saw the design bureau from his first life and himself asleep over the project. The circle was closing slowly and surely. He died at the age of 84 at the end of summer. A week earlier, he had asked to be taken to Widemore. The village had long since become a small town, but Oswald's mill stood like a monument under a glass canopy, and the wheel spun idly for visitors. Darren sat by the weir for a long time. Then he asked his grandson to hand him a wedge and a hammer, and for some reason, tapped the shaft's support a finger's width, even though the support hadn't sagged. His grandson didn't understand. Darren smiled and said he simply wanted to finish where he'd started. He was buried without fanfare, according to his own will, on Regenholm Hill, from where one can see the town, the railroad tracks, and the power lines stretching out in all 4 directions. No titles were engraved on the stone. Instead, at his request, 3 words were inscribed: Master among Masters. And 62 years after his death, on an autumn morning, the first rocket, built by the great-grandchildren of his students, according to the most advanced blueprints and calculations, perfected by the gray-haired head of the Celestial School, Marta Doran's daughter. The rocket carried neither weapons nor a flag. It carried a capsule with instruments and a copper plate, on which was engraved a letter from the creator of the repository and the reply to it. The response was composed collectively over the course of 10 years, and there were more disputes than there had been when the charter was signed. In the end, 4 sentences were retained. We have received your gift. The accounts have been settled.
Strength and goodness go hand in hand here, like a gear and an ear of grain. If you are still out there somewhere, know that the experiment was a success.
The rocket soared beyond the clouds before the eyes of 100,000 people who had gathered from all lands and from both shores. In the crowd stood the descendants of Tob and Greta, the princes of Morven, the elders of the Ashanti League, teachers of 11 languages, and ordinary people for whom clean water, a warm home, and a school around the corner had long since ceased to be a miracle, and had become as commonplace as the air. When the fiery dot dissolved into the blue sky above the plain, it grew very quiet. And then, somewhere in the crowd, an old teacher from a mountain clan told her neighbors what would be printed in every newspaper in the world the very next day, and what would later be carved onto the pedestal of the first starting table. She said that now she understood why that master had begun with a plow, because the road to the stars always begins with a furrow. And in the spring, that plain behind the launch pad, like all the plains of this world, smelled once again of freshly plowed earth. Plows moved across it in even rows. Ordinary plows with blades curved like a wave. Every village craftsman now knew how to make them, and not a single plowman could remember a time when things had been any different. And this was the very ending that Darren had chosen for himself that first evening with his tablet behind the woodpile. Not a monument, not a throne, not a name on a banner, but a world where his miracle had become an everyday occurrence. Because an inventor's true victory isn't people's admiration for the machine. It's the morning when the machine runs, and people go about their lives without even turning to look. The story of Master Darren ends here. The land is plowed. The water is clean. The letters have been distributed. The fire ascended to the sky and returned as light. The accounts have been settled. Darren returned to Regenholm, lived a long life as a teacher, married Oswald's daughter, and revealed the truth about the vault to the world while passing the rocket blueprints on to the Brotherhood's higher school as a challenge for future generations. He died at the age of 84, completing the circle at that very mill. And 62 years later, his spiritual heirs, led by his daughter Martha, launched the first rocket, a response to the vault's creator that the accounts had balanced. All plot lines were resolved. The world accepted this knowledge as commonplace, and the story concluded with the plowing of the launch field for the road to the stars begins with a furrow. A grand council was scheduled for the fall in the capital. Preparations lasted half a year, and for half a year, Darren could not sit still. He knew the significance of the final stage, but did not know its contents. The tablet remained silent. The line of the final level glowed steadily and wouldn't open even a hair's breadth. Sometimes at night, he caught himself feeling a fear he hadn't even experienced before Verikun's interrogation. He was afraid that behind the last line there would be nothing but emptiness, a beautiful period with no continuation. Or worse yet, a mockery. He drove away that fear with work, and there was enough work for 3 people. The capital was being rebuilt around the cathedral, and the reconstruction was proceeding in stages. Right above the train station, they're erecting a glass vault, the work of old Jorgen, under which 3 trains could stand at once. And the master glassmaker, now in his 70s, walks the scaffolding himself, berating the installers in 3 languages he picked up from his overseas apprentices. The printing houses are publishing a compendium of knowledge in 11 languages, and Verikun personally proofreads every translation, surrounding himself with dictionaries like a fortress wall. And one day he finds the word slave in the southern translation, where the word student should be, and the gray-haired archbishop berates the translators so loudly it can be heard across the square. Here, Greta, now head of the foundry district, is casting a bell for the cathedral from the first Beselov steel, and the first casting cracks. Greta stands by the furnace for 3 nights, recalculating the additives until the second one comes out flawless, and the sound of the steel bell turns out to be long and high, the likes of which no bronze had ever produced. Here is Brant, aged but as straight as a ramrod, drawing up the cathedral's security schedule with the expression of a man preparing a fortress's defenses. And he grumbles to Darren that guarding peace is harder than war, because in war at least you know where to expect trouble. Embassies had been arriving for a month, and for that month, the city had come to resemble a fair of all the nations of the earth. The Ashanti League arrived first, led by the completely gray-haired Tahar, who stepped off the train under the glass dome, looked around, and told Darren, hugging him as if he were his own son, that 20 years ago he had carried gold across the ocean as a down payment. But now he understood that the ships themselves had been the down payment, and this roof of light had become the payment. The 7 overseas kingdoms arrived in garments that made one's eyes blur, and their scholars' first request was not to see the palace, but the water treatment plant. Morven sent Prince Eirik with an entire school of young craftsmen, and Eirik, out of old habit, went straight to the workshops, before any receptions, and until midnight he worked with the first-year students on the shafts, recalling the feel of the work. Mountain clans, river nomads, eastern princes, and southern sultanates, all of whom had learned of everything that through the caravans. King Albrecht, who had grown heavier and was going bald, walked among the guests as the guest of honor, for the council had gathered on his land and during his reign. And every so often he would lead envoys to Darren, saying that he had once had nearly put in irons, and thank heaven he'd been too lazy to do so. Hagen, completely withered by old age, arrived in a wheeled chair made by the workshops and whispered to Darren that he'd spent his whole life counting grain and taxes. But toward the end of his life, he'd had the chance to count nations gathered at a single table, and that dying had become interesting, and that was worth its weight in gold. The council opened in the capital's largest hall under electric light, from which the overseas guests could not take their eyes for the first half hour. For 3 days, they read the charter article by article and debated. They debated each region's share of the common treasury. They discussed the language of the exams and agreed that a master would take the exam in his native language, but must be able to read a blueprint in any language. They discussed weights and measures and adopted uniform standards of the Brotherhood, since these had already been used for 20 years to cut metal on both sides of the river. They argued about vaccines, telegraph rates, and who owned a drawing conceived by a student at school, and decided that the drawing belonged to everyone while the glory went to the author. And this argument took a whole day because glory turned out to be a commodity more valuable than iron. Darren hardly intervened in the arguments. He sat in the middle row, not on the presidium, where he had been invited, and watched as people speaking 11 languages argued not about whether to go to war, but about how to divide up the textbooks. And he thought that for the sake of this spectacle alone, it had been worth living both lives. On the 4th day, they signed the charter. There were 49 signatures. The last to sign was the elder of the most distant mountain clan, who had arrived later than everyone else because his land had known no wheels until last year. The old man signed with 3 runes, pressed his palm against the paper, and said through an interpreter that for 300 years his people had come down from the mountains only to wage war, but now they had come down for letters, and that the mountains hadn't grown any lower because of it, but the people had grown taller. The hall rose to its feet. Greta's bell rang out over the capital for the first time, and its steely sound drifted over the rooftops, lingering as long as a promise. Darren stood amid the general uproar and felt beneath his shirt a steady warmth he would recognize among 1,000. He did not look at the screen in front of everyone. He stayed until the end of the celebrations, said the required words, hugged those he was supposed to hug, and listened to Takar, Eric, and the rune elder. And only after midnight did he leave, walking alone through the sleeping city to the old original workshops, and lock himself in the storeroom that he had kept exactly as it was all these years. With the same bench.
With the same lantern hook. He sat down on the bench and took out his tablet. The counter read 1,060,000. The last line glowed gold. Open. Darren touched it with a finger that suddenly felt unresponsive, just as it had on that first morning in a foreign body. The screen unfolded, and Darren read the name of the latest technology in the entire repository: liquid fuel rocket engine and the fundamentals of orbital flight. He sat motionless for a very long time. Behind the wall, the first rooster crowed. Then Darren began to scroll through the pages. The blueprints spanned hundreds of screens. Fuel-cooled combustion chambers. Pumps unlike any machine in this world had ever produced. Fuel vapors and thrust tables. Trajectory calculations where, for the first time in his memory, Earth was depicted as a sphere suspended in the blackness. Metallurgy of alloys that local science was still a good 50 years away from achieving. This was not knowledge for tomorrow. It was knowledge for the future, for a generation or even two. And beneath the last blueprint was something that hadn't appeared beneath any other in the past 20 years. Text.
A simple, unsigned letter. And as Darren read it, his hands trembled. It was written by the creator of the vault. He wrote that the device had been assembled in a world that had learned to fly to the stars. But on the way there, it had nearly burned itself to ashes 3 times because technology there always outpaced kindness by half a step, and those half steps were almost enough to bring about the end. That the repository was built as an experiment and as a hope. It is designed so that the knowledge within it is unlocked only through improved lives, not through gold, not through power, not through blood. So that strength and goodness would grow intertwined, like a gear and an ear of grain, unable to outpace one another. That many such devices were sent to different worlds and different times, and most likely were lost, wasted, left to rot in swamps, decayed in chests, or fell into hands that abandoned them at the first level, unwilling to share. And that if anyone is reading these lines, it means the experiment succeeded at least once. And once is already more than 0. Darren reread the last paragraph 10 times. The creator wrote that the rocket engine is placed last, not for flight. It is placed as a question. A world that has raised its eyes to the stars views them either as prey or as a path. A world that has reached this line through 1 million improved lives has already answered the question by the very means by which it arrived. And from this line onward, the repository will require nothing more and verify nothing. There will be no more counter. From here on, it's all up to you. The screen flickered. The number in the corner went dark. Forever. All that remained were the blueprints, all open at once, from the plow to the rocket, like a single book without locks. Darren left the storeroom as dawn broke. The sun was rising over the capital. Smoke rose from the chimneys of the workshops. Stock market dispatches and love letters raced along the wires. Somewhere across the ocean, at that very moment, a school bell was ringing for the first class. He stood in the middle of the courtyard where, 20 years ago, he had loaded a mill wheel onto a cart, and he realized that all these years he hadn't been holding a chest of blueprints in his hands. He had been holding an exam. And the exam had just ended. A week later, when the embassies had departed and the capital had celebrated itself out, Darren gathered his closest friends in that same storeroom. Toba, who came with a cane but waved off any help. Verakunda. Anselm, who had arrived for good, his face weathered from half a lifetime spent gazing at the horizon. Greta, her hands caked in indelible scale. Eric, who had lingered to say goodbye. He placed a lantern on the table. He laid out the tablet next to it in front of everyone. And he told them everything. From the very beginning. From a life as an outsider in a world of glass and iron. From the design bureau and the blueprints he'd fallen asleep over. From the blow to the ribs on a straw mattress and the first 47 souls at the mill. He spoke for 2 hours, and no one interrupted him even once. Only the lantern crackled. When he fell silent, Tob was the first to speak up. The old blacksmith looked at the glowing screen, then at Darren, and said that he'd known from the very first anvil that the boy wasn't from around here. Because people around here don't trust others that much. Greta asked only one thing. She asked if there were female masters in that other world. Darren replied that there were, and that they were the best. Greta nodded and said that meant the world wasn't hopeless. Anselm silently placed his palm on the tablet, as one might place a hand on the binding of a precious book. Verekund remained silent longer than anyone else. Then he stood up, walked over to the table, and didn't touch the screen. He said that for 30 years he had been searching for a miracle. At first, to expose it, then to understand it. And now, the miracle lay on the table, and it turned out that the miracle wasn't in the box. The box had merely been counting. The miracle was that the numbers added up. At the Great Council, the 49 lands on both banks signed a common charter of knowledge. The counter passed 1 million, and the final technology was unveiled, a rocket engine, along with a letter from the repository's creator, explaining that the tablet was an experiment in combining power with kindness, and that the engine was intended as a test of the world's maturity. The counter vanished forever, and all that remained unresolved. Darren told the whole truth about himself to his inner circle, and Tob, Greta, Anselm, and Verekund accepted it, acknowledging that the miracle lay not in the device, but in the converging count. After the council, Darren lived another 41 years, and the country later referred to those years as the Long Morning.
He was no longer in a hurry to go anywhere, for there was no longer any need to rush. Affairs took their own course, just as a river does that has long since broken its banks. He returned to Regenholm, to the old courtyard by the southern gate, where the roof had not sagged in a long time, and the courtyard still smelled of wood shavings and scale. He handed out the capital's positions to his students in a single day, throwing the chancellery into a panic and plunging his students into work. The Brotherhood Council met without him, and made sound decisions because the charter had been written in the blood of all past mistakes. And Darren attended the meetings as a guest, sitting in the back row and listening more than he spoke. He administered exams to the apprentices and was stricter than anyone else during them, because he remembered the cost of an inaccurate drawing. He taught the first-year students how to hold a file. On Thursdays, he would stand at the lathe himself and turn simple shafts so that his hands would not forget the true nature of metal. And the first-year students would gather to watch as the old man removed shavings in a single continuous curl. The years passed in slices, just as his entire life had passed in slices. And so Anselm finished the magnum opus of his life, a 6-volume history of the great teaching, which included the mill, smallpox, the Inquisition, the ocean, and the truth about the repository, told so simply that even children read it. He died a year after the publication of the final volume, quietly at his desk with a quill in his hand, on an unfinished page of notes. He was buried on 2 continents at once, because the schools across the ocean had erected a white stone cenotaph for him, and Tahar, who had lived to see that day, personally placed by the stone that first primer with dog-eared corners, which he had kept for 20 years. As for Tob, he worked in the forge until he was 80 and left only when the hammer became heavier than his pride. For another 5 years, he sat on a bench by the furnace, drinking warm beer, and the young foundryman swore that as long as the old man was watching, the metal didn't dare bubble. He died in his sleep that summer, and 400 blacksmiths from all the districts came to his funeral. Each struck the anvil once, so that the ringing hung over Regenholm until sunset. Then, Verekund retired from his professorship, passing it on to a student from the first cathedral class, and returned to Regenholm to a small house near the printing house. Every other day, the 2 old men would drink herbal tea on the porch of the workshop and argue about the soul of machines, the limits of knowledge, and what would have happened if the tablet had fallen into the hands of a warrior instead of an engineer. Verekund insisted that the vault chose its
Keepers on its own. Darren replied that it was not the box that chose the keepers, but a person's habit of repairing rather than breaking. They never reached an agreement, and both cherished that very fact. Then Greta became the first woman to head the Brotherhood's council, and no one wrote complaints anymore because a generation had grown up for whom the exam was closer to their heart than their family tree. Under her leadership, the Brotherhood opened higher education institutions in 20 cities, and until the end of her days, she signed her name not with a title, but simply with the word Foundry Woman. As for Darren himself, life wrote a chapter for him that he had not anticipated.
At the age of 40, he married Ilsa, the daughter of the miller Oswald, the very same girl who had once been given boiled water with honey to drink. The entire barony celebrated the wedding, and old Oswald wept, repeating that the master had returned his daughter to him twice over. They had 2 sons and a daughter. The eldest son became a doctor and left to establish hospitals in the southern sultanates. The younger son became a civil engineer, and his bridges later spanned 3 countries. And their daughter, Marta, inherited her father's skill with her hands and his restless spirit. From the age of 12, she would disappear into the workshops, and at 20, she came to her father with a notebook full of her own calculations for cooling the chamber, and asked about the last line of the vault with the seriousness of someone asking about the matter of a lifetime. Because the tablet had long since ceased to be a secret. After that night in the storeroom, Darren showed the creator's letter to the Brotherhood Council, and then published it openly, omitting only the part about other worlds, a decision the council deemed wise to prevent the proliferation of new sects. The world learned that this knowledge had come from a repository compiled by people from afar who valued goodness rather than gold. And the world accepted this calmly, more calmly than Darren had feared. It turned out that people didn't care so much about where the fire came from. What mattered was that the fire warmed everyone, and that they themselves added wood to it. Darren handed the tablet over to the Brotherhood's highest school under a glass dome in the main hall, where everyone could see it. The device continued to glow without needing to be charged, and first-year students would touch the dome for good luck before exams. He didn't hide the rocket blueprints, but he didn't rush them either. He gave them to the same higher school as a long-term project with one condition. Construction of the engine would not begin until metallurgy had advanced to the point of producing alloys, achieved honestly, without haste and without sacrifice. During his lifetime, they managed to build only small experimental chambers that roared on test stands outside the city, scaring away the crows. Darren went to watch the tests as an old man leaning on a cane, and young engineers respectfully explained thrust and cooling to him, unaware of what he saw in that roar. But he saw the design bureau from his first life, the drafting lamp, and himself asleep over the project. The circle closed slowly and perfectly. He died at the age of 84 at the end of summer, in a year of bountiful harvest. A week earlier, he had asked Martha to drive him to Widemore. The village had long since become a small town, but Oswald's mill stood like a monument under a glass canopy, and the wheel turned idly for visitors. Darren sat for a long time by the weir in the sun. Then he asked his grandson to hand him a wedge and a hammer and tap the shaft's support a finger's width, even though the support hadn't sagged a hair's breadth. His grandson didn't understand and asked why. Darren smiled and said he simply wanted to finish where he'd started. A week later, he didn't wake up. He was buried without fanfare, in accordance with his own will, on Regenholm Hill, from where one can see the city, the railroad tracks, and the power lines stretching out in all 4 directions. The 4th king in line from Albrecht offered a mausoleum in the capital and received a polite refusal from Martha, citing the will. No titles or list of machines were engraved on the stone. 3 words were engraved according to his wishes: master among masters. And 62 years after his death, on a clear autumn morning, the first rocket, built by the great-grandchildren of his students, according to the latest blueprints and calculations, perfected by the gray-haired head of the Celestial School, Martha, Darren's daughter, who did not live to see the launch by 2 years, but had verified every single figure. The rocket carried neither weapons nor a flag. It carried a capsule with instruments and a copper plate, on which were engraved the letter from the creator of the repository, and the reply to it. The reply had been composed by the entire world over the course of 10 years, and there were more disputes over the 4 sentences than there had once been over the 49 signatures. In the end, they left it as is. We have received your gift. The accounts have been settled. Strength and goodness go hand in hand here, like a gear and an ear of grain. If you are still out there somewhere, know that the experiment was a success. The rocket vanished beyond the clouds before the eyes of 100,000 people who had gathered from all lands and both shores of the ocean. In the crowd stood the descendants of Tob,
the entire blacksmith clan, and Greta's granddaughter, the head of the Foundry Council. There stood the Morven princes of Irik's bloodline, and the elders of the Ashanti League, who had brought a handful of earth from Tahar's grave. There stood teachers of 11 languages and ordinary people for whom clean water, a warm home, and a school just around the corner had long since ceased to be a miracle and had become as commonplace as the air. When the fiery speck dissolved into the blue sky above the plain, it grew very quiet. So quiet that you could hear a child crying somewhere beyond the cordon, and a mother soothing him with the words that the iron bird had flown away to visit friends. And then, in the crowd, an old schoolteacher from the mountain clan, the granddaughter of the elder who had signed the charter in runes, told her neighbors what would be printed in every newspaper in the world the very next day, and what would later be carved onto the pedestal of the first launch pad. She said that now she understood why that master had begun with a plow. Because the road to the stars always begins with a furrow. And in the spring, that plain behind the launch pad, like all the plains of this world, smelled once again of freshly plowed earth. Plows moved across it in even rows. Ordinary moldboard plows with plowshares curved like a wave. Every village blacksmith now knew how to forge them, and they cost about as much as a pair of boots. And not a single one of the plowmen following them could remember a time when things had been any different. And this was the ending that Darren had chosen for himself that first evening by the woodpile, with the warm plate in his hands. Not a monument, not a throne, not a name on a banner, but a world where his miracle had become commonplace. Because an inventor's true victory isn't people's admiration for a machine. It's a morning when the machine is running, and people are going about their lives without even turning to look. The story of Master Darren ends here. The land is plowed. The water is clean. The letters have been distributed. The fire ascended into the sky and returned as light. Darren lived a long morning in Regenholm as a teacher. He married Ilse, Oswald's daughter. He raised his children, including his daughter Martha. He revealed the truth about the vault to the world. He placed the tablet under glass at the high school, and he bequeathed that a rocket be built only by honest means without haste. He died at the age of 84, coming full circle at the mill where it all began, and 62 years later, the first rocket, bearing a response to its creator, soared into the sky before the eyes of the descendants of all his comrades in arms. The final image of plowed fields near the launch site concludes the story with the thought that the road to the stars begins with a furrow